Good morning. Welcome to today's informational webinar on preventing hand injuries. My name is Ryan Bast of the Motor Safety Association, presenting this webinar in partnership with the Western Equipment Dealers Association. You may have noticed that all the microphones are muted, and the reason we do that is to minimize background noise and distortion. However, if you do have any questions, please enter them into the chat box, and once the webinar concludes, all questions and answers will be sent to participants of the webinar. So let's get started. I'll go through a brief introduction to preventing hand injuries. I'll touch on the WCB stats and OHS legislation. I will talk about hand care and hand hazards. We'll look at various types of personal protective equipment gloves to keep your hands safe, as well as highlight different hand injury types, as well as first aid care for a hand injury, and review and conclude. So let's kick off the webinar by talking about how important are your hands. Your hands make you a skilled, valuable worker, and hands are one of the most complex parts of your body. Without your hands, it'd be very extremely difficult to do simple routine tasks that we take for granted. The movement of tendons, bones, tissues, and nerves allow you to grip and do a wide variety of complex jobs. Risk of hand injuries greatly increase when the wrong tool is used or if the right tool is used improperly. So we know our hands are very important and we need to keep them safe. So let's try this practical exercise. Tuck your thumbs into the palms of your hand. Now try to tie your shoes. That's not very easy, is it? This just highlights how important a functioning hand with the fingers are at all times. When we look at the last 5 years of WCB statistics, we can see that the number of hand injuries has slightly decreased. I do not have the year-end 2018 data as of this time because our year isn't completed. However, at the end of the third quarter, we're sitting at 198 hand injuries to the end of the third quarter of 2018. So we will see if that number, how that fares to the 2017 comparison once our year end is completed. But what I can show you is in the last 5 years, in 2017, we had a bit of a spike in the cost of hand injuries. That could be due to medical costs, costs associated with treating those types of hand injuries. And again, in our industry, to the end of third quarter this year, we're sitting at 335,000. So what I can say is we'll definitely be ahead of our 2016 costs, and it remains to be seen how that will compare to 2017. At either rate, when we look at frequency and severity of hand injuries, we know this is a concern that we want to bring to light for people to be aware of with the discussion in today's webinar. I have an excerpt on the slide from the Saskatchewan Legislation regarding hand and arm protection. This legislation sets out the requirements and calls for the use of hand protection. Feel free to use this information to perhaps develop your own hand safety policy or your rules that you can utilize in your workplace. And this legislation can serve as a framework or guide to accomplish this. I'll provide you with some general tips for good hand care. Avoid washing your hands with solvents, harsh soaps, or abrasives, because in the long term, these types of solvents and soaps and abrasives can be absorbed into your organs. And I had a discussion with a tech professor who is in one of the tech schools for automotive service. and he informed me that he used to use the solvent tank with Varsol and never used gloves. And now, after years of exposure, just the slightest drops of that product, if he isn't wearing gloves, causes rash and extreme irritation. So over time, that has caused this person a lot of difficulties. So that's why it's important to protect your hands. Ensure that you clean and bandage all cuts and abrasions to avoid infection, and immediately remove any embedded or foreign type of materials. Be sure to wash immediately after using chemicals. Even if you do not detect leakage and you are wearing gloves, it's still a best practice to wash in case there is any residue that may have came into contact with your hands or the areas near your hands. Be sure to pay attention to skin rashes, and if the rash worsens, be sure to seek medical attention. Another tip for hand care is you can wear cotton gloves under rubber gloves to reduce sweating and blisters that can occur. I'd like you to follow along with me and do this hand exercise with me. And by stretching your fingers and spreading them wide apart for a few seconds, and be sure to repeat that 3 times with each hand. Next, stretch your thumbs by holding it down gently for 5 seconds. And do that 3 times for each hand. You can do stretching of your wrists by making circles with your hands, and repeat 10 times for each hand. By doing simple hand exercises, you can reduce the risk of an ergonomic or repetitive motion injury. And I think these types of injuries sometimes may be forgotten about. When we think about hand injuries, we may think about the immediate things that happen, such as the cuts or bruises that we feel immediately. And some of these long-term repetitive motion or ergonomic injuries we may not be aware of because of the gradual discomfort until we have a long-term injury. So I encourage you to think about ergonomics and hand care exercises. So how can we protect our hands? I encourage you to look at the chart and think about the hierarchy of controls. Let's try to eliminate that hand hazard at the source. So if we can eliminate that, or perhaps substitute it with another device or process that isn't as dangerous or where the risk is reduced, that would be an acceptable measure. Of course, the best practice is to eliminate it entirely, but if we can't eliminate it, let's look at substituting it with something safer. We can also look then at our engineering controls, which would include safeguards, as well as our administrative controls. And that utilizes our job hazard analysis and risk assessment, which gives us our safe work procedure. So following that procedure would be an example of an administrative control. And lastly is the personal protective equipment, and in this case, the gloves. So I encourage you to think about the big picture. Don't just hang up a hand safety poster and tell people that in order to prevent hand injuries, we're going to wear these gloves. We need to think about the big picture and not just resort to PPE. Think about the hierarchy of controls and look at these processes of eliminating the hazards or utilizing substitution engineering controls or administrative policy and procedure before we resort to PPE gloves. So I encourage you to think along that process line. As you can see from this slide, there are various types of hand hazards, some that you may have thought of and some that you may not have thought of when we think about hand hazards. And I'll go through some of these hand hazards in the coming slides. So let's talk first off about knives. And when you're using knives, use a safety knife whenever possible. And that's a knife that would have a self-retracting blade. So when you take your finger off the trigger, it's spring-loaded and retracts so that it goes back into the holder and the blade is no longer exposed. Keep your knife blades sharp by cutting only what they're intended to cut. And when you are cutting, follow a safe work practice and cut away from your body, not towards yourself. Don't use your knife blade as screwdrivers, as they aren't intended to be screwdrivers, again, because that knife could slip off and cut yourself, or if you are working with a knife around a coworker, it could cut someone in close proximity if you are using a knife and you're not careful or using it for the wrong intended purpose, or if your coworker is doing that as well. So if you do have to change the blades, be sure that you never dispose of used razor blades or broken glass or other types of sharp objects in the regular trash cans, because people that empty these trash cans could be hurt when they grab the bag and they're trying to pack it perhaps and they're removing it. And keep a sharps disposal container or a metal can specifically designed for disposal of these types of sharp objects, because again, these are all potential hand hazards. The next few slides will be talking similarly to safe work practices of various tools. And we talk about tools because they can cause a hand injury, which is an important point in preventing hand injuries for this webinar. And I'll refer you to, at the end of the webinar, where you have access to safe work practices, which you can utilize from our website. When it comes to hand saws, use moderate pressures on the hand saw to prevent blade failure. Don't twist a blade when cutting, because that can increase the risk of a hand injury if your saw jams. If you're using hacksaws, you can spray lightly with a lubricant before cutting metal, and this will keep the blade sharper, minimize friction. So if our saw is working freely, the chances are our hands are going to also flow freely along with that process and not be in a situation where it's binding or jamming, which can cause the hand to come off and perhaps in contact with the saw blade. When using screwdrivers, place the object that you're screwing on a flat surface or in a vise. Do not attempt to hold it in your other hand while you're trying to screw it, because if that blade jumps off, it all of a sudden pokes into the palm of your hand, and now you're dealing with a cut in your hand. And be sure to use the screwdriver for its intended purpose. It's not a chisel or a pry bar. By utilizing it for a different purpose, you can chip the tip of your screwdriver, which you don't want to occur either. When it comes to using hammers, never use a hammer with a splinter or cracked or loose handle, because that hammer handle or the hammer head can fly off or separate, and that could hurt your hand or a bystander. And when we look at some of the other points on this slide, it's important to use the correct hammer for the intended task, especially when it comes to removing nails. If you're using a claw hammer to remove a nail, that's the appropriate practice when you are removing a nail with a claw hammer, because claws are not meant to pry. Sometimes people can use the back of a claw hammer to pry, and therefore they could cause a hand injury in doing so. When using chisels, use a safety chisel or chisel holder, as you see in the diagram. And this device allows you to keep the chisel in an area and your hand in a separate zone where it can in fact not be contacted. So getting the hand out of the trajectory zone, using that safety chisel holder, allows you to keep your hand a safe distance from where you're hitting the hammer head on the end of the chisel. And also take an inspection. Look at your tools before you're using them. Ensure that your chisels don't have a mushroomed head or that you are using the correct chisel for the job. Therefore, when you're using the correct tool, you're less likely to have it slip or expose your hands to an area where a danger could occur if it does slip, or you're using it for the wrong intended purpose, such as a pry bar. Be sure to use the correct wrench for the job you're doing. Sometimes in comparison to using SAE or metric size wrenches, people may have a wrench that is close, but it's not correct. And that wrench can slip, causing you to bust up your knuckles. So be sure that you use the correct wrench size for the correct application. Again, take a look and inspect your pliers or pipe wrenches to ensure that they aren't stripped or the jaws are sprung. And that will ensure that your hands will not slip when you are using the correct tools properly and they're not wore or in possible slipping. Be sure to pull on wrenches rather than pushing on them. And never use a cheater bar or a snipe on a wrench, because that wrench could bend or break and therefore causing your hands to slip and become possibly contacted with the object you're trying to remove. When it comes to portable power tools, be sure to always disconnect the power tools, unplug them when they're not in use, and before changing bits, blades, and other accessories. If you fail to do that and you're attempting to change a blade on a Sawzall, for example, you could cut your fingers severely. So again, follow the safe word practices when it comes to tooling. Ensure that the power tools are unplugged before attempting to change any accessories. If your power tool binds when you're using it, stop what you're doing. Don't force the tool and reassess the job. Again, because this can cause a kickback or a reaction, which can in fact cause damage to your hands. What about vibration when it comes to power tools? If we're using an impact wrench, utilize anti-vibration wrap. A product called Zorbothane wrapped around the handles of power tools can reduce that vibration exposure that would be absorbed into your hands. You can also use a Zorbothane type of, or an anti-vibration type of glove. But think about the hierarchy of controls. If you put it right on the tool itself, you're not going to have to rely on PPE to keep your hands safe with the glove. So if you put it on the tool, you can use the combination of the gloves in addition to that to reduce the exposure of vibration. And be sure never to remove guards, such as we see in the circular saw on the bottom of this slide, as you do not want to cut your finger with one of those. And again, secure any work that you're doing in a vise or on a bench, and don't hold it in your hand when you are using portable power tools. Very similar points on this slide when it comes to shop tools, specifically around table saws. Don't use your fingers to push in close proximity to a table saw blade. I've seen people cut their fingers on table saws in the past, so that's something that you definitely want to avoid. When you're looking at those types of devices, be sure that your tools are kept sharp, that again, by using them for the intended purpose and not cutting materials that should not be cut, because your blade could be damaged or break apart and could cause damage to your hands or other body parts. Especially when you're trying to hold the parts with your hands. You can see on this bottom slide where someone has a nut, a hexagon nut, that slid onto their index finger. For some reason, I've seen people trying that. If they're using an impact wrench, they try to hold the other side of it with their finger or check it with their finger. And Unfortunately, in this situation, that hexagon nut became lodged on that index finger. Bench grinders. We see numerous bench grinders in a lot of shops that we conduct facility inspections in. Some of them are missing guards, and we advise employers and supervisors at facilities and frontline workers that the guarding needs to be in place. Never remove guards, as they are there for a purpose. Another huge concern when we talk about the bench grinders is the RPM of the discs. If the grinder RPM exceeds the RPM of the wheel, it can burst and cause an injury to your hand, or it could go through your chest or penetrate through your body. So maintain proper clearances on tool rests and guards on your grinders to keep your hands safe, especially ensuring that those end shields are there, because sometimes those tend to go missing when the grinder wheels are replaced. So again, keep your guarding in place and set properly. Ensure that your RPMs on the wheels are correct for the grinder, and all these factors will keep your hands safe. If you're working with products that are extreme temperatures, I recommend always using tongs or high temperature gloves to handle these hot or cold parts, items, or equipment. And in addition to that, inspect your gloves before you use them to ensure that they are in fact safe and that will protect you for the required applications. I'll talk a bit about bites and stings. This is an item that sometimes people may not think about when it comes to preventing hand injuries. But by sticking your hands in areas that you might not be an area that you should do so normally, maybe you're conducting a repair on a vehicle and you're reaching in behind a dash or somewhere where you can't see, and what if there's a insect or a rodent perhaps that's in there? So just be aware of when you're reaching in where you can't see that you could experience a bite or a sting. And insects and rodents, they tend to nest and congregate around certain types of areas, garbage cans, stagnant pools of water, those types of areas. Wasps, those insects can come out and sting you in the hand. And even too, scented soaps and perfumes can also attract insect bites to your hands or other body parts. When handling equipment, as seen in the slide, using tag lines is important to prevent the item from swinging, which can make contact with other body parts. Also is wearing a hard hat, not a ball cap, as seen on the slide. But again, when we think about hand injuries, tag lines are important, as are wearing leather gloves. That's the best choice around material and equipment handling. Be sure never to place your hand in an area where it can potentially be hurt. Think about what you're doing and ensure that you don't put your hand in an area where it can come into contact with an object. And again, be sure to conduct inspections of hooks and rigging or any type of those lifting materials, because again, you can keep your hands safe as well as other body parts. Before I flip to the next slide, I just want to disclose that it is a bit graphic. It's as a person who lost their finger from wearing jewelry. So if you wish to look away, please do so now. Again, jewelry, remove jewelry before using power tools or working on machines. Here's a picture of someone who lost their finger. Jewelry can act as a pinch point or a real catch point, and a ring it's like a noose right around your finger, and it just compresses and it can pull it right off. Unfortunately, as we've seen in this slide, I too have seen someone lose their finger. It isn't very nice at all. Some other tips around jewelry and watches and rings. Keep your sleeves buttoned. A watch can get caught, or your sleeve can get caught and pull your hand into a machine. and that can cause a severe injury. So now that we've talked about the different types of hand injuries, we'll switch gears and talk a little bit about gloves. And how do you know if the glove size you're using is correct, or especially if you're ordering gloves and you might not be able to try them on? With the ruler, start at your index finger and measure the width of your hand in the knuckle area. And by using the chart below, this will give you reference to sizing. So this chart can serve as a guide when you are ordering gloves from your supplier. There are many, many different types of gloves for the different applications. It's always best recommended to contact your supplier for the glove that best suits the jobs you're doing at your workplace, or if you have a safety representative. Another good area to get information from is your safety data sheets. And again, following your procedures or hazard analysis in the workplace will also point you into the direction of the gloves needed. And it's an item that I tell people that it's important to mention, make sure that when you are purchasing gloves, that they do meet a standard. And recently, Canada adopted the ANSI 2016 cut standards. And in that standard, there's 9 different ratings. And these are color coded, so you can tell at a glance which rating standard people have for their gloves. For example, the gray charted A1 gloves, they offer less protection and a blade cut pressure of only 500 grams, where an A9 glove is the highest level and offers pressure up to 600 grams. So again, knowing the application of the work you're doing, it allows you to find a glove that meets in one of those applicable standards to the correct pressure or protection that you're looking to achieve. Because when you're trying to determine which glove is best, there are so many options. For example, a cotton glove, or I call a gardening glove, is good for just general light-duty material handling and cleanup work. Leather gloves are great for equipment handling, general construction, welding, or hot or cold materials. There's our anti-vibration glove, handy around impact wrenches, rotary hammers, or other vibrating or oscillating types of equipment. Then there's your Kevlar or wire mesh, which is great to work with sheet metal, glass, or heavy cutting. Then we have our rubber, nitrile, PVC types of materials, which I'll speak to in the coming slides. Then we have our insulated, or I call Canadian type of extreme temperature gloves that we use in the workplace. And again, which glove is best, looking at the work that's done to determine which need you can achieve by matching the glove to the task being completed. As I said before, around chemical gloves, there are a lot of different options, and referring to your safety data sheet or your supplier will point you in the direction of matching the glove material to the products that you're working with. Because not all chemical gloves are created equal. When we look at our chart on the left in yellow, and with the glove materials going horizontally in pink, you can see as a visual summary that not every glove will protect your hands the same. So knowing again what chemicals or products you work with or around will enable you to utilize the correct gloves. And again, always remember your safety data sheet will give you that information. Be sure it is up to date and readily available. So how do chemicals get in? Well, when we look at permeation, that's the diffusion through the glove and through the material on a molecular basis. So it just permeates right through the chemical gloves. As well as penetration. Chemicals can enter through zippers, punctures, or seams and absorbs through into your hands, into your skin. Or there's degradation, and that's when the chemical causes a change and it breaks down the glove material, and sometimes it can eat through it, and that in fact can cause exposure. So a good summary around glove care is to inspect your gloves before use for tears, excessive wear, and punctures. Again, be sure you're using the correct glove type for the task that you're completing. Store your gloves in a clean, dry location. If it's a disposable glove, be sure to dispose of those and not reuse them. And when it comes to leather and cloth gloves, you don't have to discard those after every use. Those are gloves that you want to ensure that you use them until it's no longer safe to use them. When they've become saturated with oil or other chemicals, or they have holes in, or they become damaged, and they're not going to protect you anymore. So just take a look and inspect those gloves. And again, if they are exposed to chemicals, they're going to be slippery and not keep you safe. And when it comes to chemical types of gloves, you can conduct a leak test by sealing the wrist and filling the glove with air, using a clean plastic tube or low pressure air line, not your mouth, to achieve this. In the previous slides, we spoke about preventing hand injuries, different types of hand injuries, and glove selection. In the next slides, we will speak about an actual hand injuries that could have occurred. And these 3 points are all potential causes of hand injuries, whether it be associated with working with machinery or equipment, the materials used or the job process might be hazardous, and that could cause a hand injury, or the hand tools or powered hand tools may be faulty or improperly used. Some common causes of hand injuries could in fact be carelessness and lack of awareness. Those all tie together. So if I'm not paying attention to the job I'm doing, maybe I'm complacent, I'm there, but I'm presenteeism, I guess would be the word. I'm there, but I'm not completely engaged in the task that I'm doing. That ties into perhaps boredom, if repetitive tasks, so we may not even be thinking about the job that we're doing. Or what if we have a safe work procedure and I just don't follow it? I don't need to wear my gloves this time. It's just for a few seconds, and I disregard that procedure and I do suffer a hand injury. Or I become distracted. Hey, it's only a week to Christmas. I'm thinking about presents to wrap and all these other processes. I'm distracted in what I'm doing and could suffer a hand injury. So as you can see on this slide, these are some common types of hand injuries, which I will speak to in the coming slides. And this actually is a poster that it's a screenshot essentially of a poster, which I'll PDF email to all attendees of today's webinar, which they can print in-house and put up in their workplaces. So let's speak about some of these items on this slide of the different common types of hand injuries. Starting with crushes, where an object forcefully contacts and compresses your hand or finger. Or there's the musculoskeletal, such as trigger finger or Raynaud's disease. And this can be disabling when people perhaps have used impact wrenches for long periods of time without taking any type of vibration reduction. Their knuckles curl up and they stay curled up and they turn white. This can lead to a variety of other symptoms like swelling, tingling, numbness, and pain in the hands, and limited use of those fingers from musculoskeletal type of hand injuries. There could be sprains or overstretching of ligaments, and frostbite, contact with cold objects or cold weather or cold tools for extreme periods of time can cause frostbite. Cuts, fractures, punctures, and amputations can sever nerves, tendons, and they can become infected. This can lead to loss of movements and we're no longer able to use our hands and enjoy the quality of life that we did before we suffered a hand injury. We could suffer a fracture and damage nearby tissue, and these are difficult to repair. Or we could have dermatitis. This may show up immediately after contact on our hands with a chemical, causing the skin to become red, swollen, itchy, and may develop into blisters. Or dermatitis may develop after several contacts with chemicals known as sensitizers. And this is the case when you have contact with a chemical and nothing happens initially. And then later contacts after longer exposure produces an allergic reaction, and then the damage is done. Those are types of hand injuries. And they all take a long time to heal because look at your hand, flip it over, the complexity of your hand, your knuckles, fingers, all the moving parts. And after a hand injury, as I said in the previous slide, you may not have that quality of life where your hand was able to function as it did before. We could have a loss in motion, a limited range with our hands and fingers, dexterity in our grip, and the ability to complete the simplest tasks, such as tying our shoes or using utensils when we're enjoying a meal. So in summary, to avoid hand injuries, know the hazards and dangers of the job. Think about the hierarchy of controls. Do that hazard assessment. Evaluate the risk before we do those tasks. Watch for pinch points. Be aware of hot work areas. Also, rotating or moving parts. Don't become complacent around these items. Don't wear loose clothing or jewelry, as they may be caught in moving machinery and can tear off your finger, as we've seen in the slides. Keep safeguards in place for tools and items that you're using to ensure that they are taken care of so we can protect our hands. And inevitably, if we can't avoid a hand injury, I'll leave you with a few first aid points for hands. In the event of a cut, apply direct pressure to a large or bleeding area. Be sure to cut and be sure to elevate that hand above the shoulder. Clean a small cut with soap and water and cover it with a sterile bandage. So keep it clean, direct pressure, elevate. When it comes to burns, immerse in cool water or run cool water over the burned area. If it's broken bones, keep the hand still and get professional help. If in the event of an amputation to a finger, apply pressure to the injured area immediately and preserve the amputated part in a plastic bag with ice and seek immediate medical attention. When it comes to sprains, apply cold compresses to reduce that pain and swelling. If it's a chemical burn, generally you want to rinse that with running water for at least 15 minutes. You got to refer to your safety data sheets because sometimes water can make a burn worse depending what products you're working with. So that comes back to our hazard analysis, knowing what we're working with and following the plan to prevent that type of exposure. And when it comes to heat burns, soak minor burns in cold water, then apply a sterile bandage. A burn that is charred or blistered does also require immediate medical attention. So again, hopefully you don't need to utilize these first aid tips, but I just remind people to ensure that you have trained first aid attendants in the workplace and they are trained in this type of hand care for addressing hand first aid as well as other types of injuries. But again, hopefully through prevention, we can minimize the reliance on looking after the first aid component. So as we review and conclude, all attendees today, as mentioned, will receive the PDF of a hand safety poster as well as toolbox talks on hand safety. If you were to go to our website, www.motorsafety.ca, you'll also find some of those safe work practices around the power tools, which will also address points for hand injury prevention. So I encourage you to download any one of those free safe work practices that you may need in your workplace. All attendees will receive an educational certificate template. Put your name on that and print it off and save it for your records. As well as at the conclusion of the webinar, an evaluation survey will be emailed to you in order to provide feedback. Because we are looking for future topics for our webinars, of topics of interest for the attendees. And we do post all past webinars on our website, and this one will be posted later this week to the website. So this could be you with a completely amputated finger. I encourage you to call to action and challenge your workplace to address the potential hand safety concerns. Think about the hierarchy of controls. How can we eliminate hand hazards at the source? Maybe we need to do a better job with guarding or our job hazard analysis. Do we have procedures in place? And is the PPE available to keep our hands safe? So watch out, protect our hands, and look at the hierarchy of controls and accept this challenge to keep hands safe in your workplace. At this time, our webinar concludes on preventing hand injuries. However, I'll keep the webinar open for about another minute, or just if you have any questions you may have thought of that you wanted to type in. And once I conclude the webinar, you should see that survey and opportunity for feedback and coming to you. I will also send a separate email with those attachments. Our contact information is on the slide, as well as our website for the safe work procedures or practices that I spoke about, and contact information. So thank you for taking the time to join me today in our webinar on preventing hand injuries.